Okay, friends, we're ready to go on. We're ready to start the final panel. Okay, thank you. My name is Schott. I am senior researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies. So impressed that so many people are sticking it out through the end on this glorious day. But you will know few Danes are present. They're all out there. I've been given strict instructions for how to proceed, so I will do my best to follow those, and that means introducing our final three speakers one at a time. They will have max 18 minutes. I have been told to be strict, and then we'll take the discussion together. First speaker, I'm delighted to present Megan Warin. You will notice in this last set of papers that we'll be talking about bodies and materialities. I don't know how much focus you've been having about that along the way, but this will be emerging here. Megan will be speaking on the topic, what can and can't we do with epigenetic knowledge in a settler colonial nation? She is a professor and social anthropologist at the University of Adelaide and also international fellow at a center associated with University of Oxford in anthropology. And her work focuses on gender dynamics of disordered eating, structural disadvantage and obesity, public health interventions, and the politics of gender, reproduction, and racism in the fields of the developmental origins of health and disease. So why don't I just turn the floor over to Megan.
Thank you so much, Robin. So the work I'm presenting today took place on Aboriginal lands in settler Australia, on Kaurna land, on Gadigal land, and on Wurundjeri land. And I would like to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging of these lands, and I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd also like to pay my respects to the Indigenous and First Nations people here today. So, like much research, this was a team project, and the title of our Australian Research Council Discovery Project was The Politics of Epigenetic Hope and Hype in Indigenous Australia. And the other team members were, you can see here on the slide, we also had a National Advisory Committee. This was very much a COVID project, which actually did finish last year in 2023. So in consultation with our National Advisory Committee, which comprised quite a significant number of Indigenous people as well, we use the tools of anthropology and science and technology studies, STS studies, to do this. So we conducted an ethnographic project investigating how the science of epigenetics was being employed by Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers working in Indigenous health in Australia, and how these researchers, policymakers and public media understood intergenerational transmission of health in Indigenous communities. And to do this, we did participant observation at relevant scientific conferences, national and international conferences and workshops, and conducted open-ended interviews with Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers across Australia. This did also include, when lockdowns permitted, some ethnographic research. So Hetty Byrne, who was our PhD student at the time, travelled to the Anangu Pitjantjatjara lands in the north of the state of South Australia with some Indigenous community members who were actually they were descendants of the Maralinga atomic testing, which was conducted by the British in the 1950s. So looking at the intergenerational effects of that exposure to radiation. We were interested in how molecular frames and idioms of this science of epigenetics were increasingly employed on the ground to describe the impacts of colonisation and racism on Indigenous lives and intergenerational trauma. Because we had started, the impetus for this project was that we had started to see the ways in which epigenetics as a discourse was being used in a whole variety of different discourses, both in scientific discourses and popular discourses. So what is epigenetics? Not to foreground the science as the most predominant issue here, but of course because we were interviewing scientists, I think it's good for an audience to have a sense of what epigenetics is. So in a nutshell, it's a very broad field, it's quite complex, very many different types of epigenetics, but we were interested in environmental epigenetics, so the ways in which environments during gestation, in utero, hence the image here, and outside the body shape how our genes are expressed, the epigenome. And so these exposures which epigenetics scientists talk about could be things like air pollution, they could be malnutrition, so famine, conversely feast as well, like overeating, poverty, trauma, stress, pesticides, pollutants, plastic bottles and so forth, smoking, alcohol, poor nutrition. These are the sort of classic sort of exposures, radiation and so forth, which in this hypothesis are said to lead to increased risk of chronic disease, so things like obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, possibly across generations, and that can possibly be reversible. And hence the picture, the image of the pregnant woman, the pregnant person here. And so all of these things inside this body are identified as exposures which can be passed on through these molecular mechanisms as the fetus is growing, which can have lifelong impacts and potentially across generations. And these epigenetic experiences, events and memories can be passed on from grandparents to parents to children through generations. And so some of you may have heard about, one of the classic studies in this field is the Dutch winter famine. I'm very So this is very much an intersection of the biological and social worlds, and we have termed this biohabitus as a concept. So I'm really grateful to my Australian colleagues who have also really highlighted, and I think it's very important to highlight the heterogeneity of Indigenous peoples in Australia. So this is an Indigenous mapping of Australia, very different to the colonial mapping, which really outlines the many, many different language groups and clans within Australia. And so I cannot do justice to the history in the limited time I have, but these are some of the key moments which Indigenous peoples are talking about in terms of trauma, and very much reiterate the point that we are not in a post-colonial climate, that these traumas are very much everyday, ongoing, present, persistent. And so here's a picture of some young boys, and so we learnt the other day how these children were taken from their families and taken to all sorts of missions, often religious missions, where they were not allowed to speak their language, to perform their cultural traditions or rituals, and it was most often a very, very harsh environment to be in. This era ended only really quite recently in the 1970s. And so more recently, after the national apology, there have been reparations packages. I won't talk about this now, but some of the historical trauma, which is based around some of the evidence put forward around epigenetics, is being used strategically, politically, in legal ways in order to argue for reparations for these past heinous policies. The removal of children is not something which finished in the 1970s, so there are terrible statistics about the number of Indigenous children who are still today being taken into care through child protection services, and it remains an ongoing issue. As well as issues around black deaths in custody, again, long-standing issues, which have not been resolved, and so we speak to the criminal the social injustices here around the criminal injustice system. Obviously linking in with wider, global systems, global issues around Black Lives Matter. And more recently, some of the evidence around the massacres which have occurred are coming to light through some excellent Indigenous and historian scholarship. So some of you probably heard that in October last year we had a national referendum where all Australians were able to vote on whether Indigenous people could have a voice to Parliament, and sadly that was defeated. And so really just to give you a sense of the discrimination and racism which is ongoing. So with that very brief background, all of this ongoing structural violence clearly has an impact on Aboriginal health across generations. And I'm not going to talk about what we identify as the deficit statistics. I think we all know what they are as a result. But this is Stan Grant, who is a very prominent, very well-respected journalist in Australia, an Indigenous man, and he puts into context these ideas about trauma in relation to epigenetics, and so explaining some of these statistics around Indigenous health and well-being. He says the child in the mother's womb can carry the trauma of their mother's life. DNA becomes distorted, and I think this is at the heart of what we're seeing in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people today. He goes on to say that ancestral trauma lives in us still, and it is passed on in mother's milk. It becomes written in our genes, and there is a scientific name for it: transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. And so, this is part of a popular rendition of epigenetics, but some Indigenous scientists quite recently are using epigenetics in conjunction with Indigenous ways of being in the world to actively improve health and well-being, and doing some really important scientific studies in Australia. So there's a very diverse ways in terms of the reception of epigenetics amongst Indigenous scientists and commentators, but there are two things that I want to focus on today in some of our findings, and one of them is the positive reception around epigenetics, because what it does is it offers a really compelling framework to link social pasts with biological presence. It provides a culturally relevant way of understanding the embodied transmission of trauma and ill health from colonial histories across generations. And it also suggests that trauma is not simply located in individual bodies of people, as in Western understandings, but in interconnected webs. And again, I thank my colleagues who talked about this the other day, the interconnected webs of social, ecological and spiritual relationships, so connections to country. So Indigenous ways of being in the world, of relationships to all environments, so not just the in utero environment, but we have to think of environments much more broadly, resonates with what we're terming, or has been named as, the relational ontology of Indigenous Australians. And we are seeing this in some of the data from our participants around this, and it's not to suggest that these two things are the same, because they are not Indigenous worldviews, but there are some allegiances between these worldviews and molecular biology of epigenetics, in that the boundaries of the person are not coterminous with the body as it's constituted in a Western understanding. And so here are some of the things which our participants said. Epigenetics is something that we've known for a long time, and they laughed about this. You Western scientists are just catching up with this. We just didn't have a name for it. Words like these, words like epigenetics, are just a different way of naming the stories that Aboriginal people have passed on to each other. And I definitely think the idea of health being transmitted across generations is more consistent with Indigenous knowledge systems. It's just not called epigenetics. And we see the very similar discourses appearing amongst other First Nation and Indigenous nations. So in the US, in Canada, and here's Amy Bombay's work in Canada, looking at that relationship between Indigenous and Western science. So if Aboriginal well-being is maintained through relationships of mutual care, of kin, and a range of non-human affiliations and obligations that are described by law and dreaming and encoded in the landscape, then our participants said to us, if we look after the environment looks after us. Indigenous cultures and people are so intimately connected to the land and environment and other people and relationships, and every one of those things can create an epigenetic change. If you're well connected to land and well connected to ancestors and traditions, then you will have a long and healthy life. So just thinking back to the previous slides I showed about those different policies in terms of colonisation, these have all changed relationships between people, between their environments, with country, kin, and so forth. And so these images here are representations from the Healing Foundation, and they use these images as a way of thinking about how if the environments are destroyed, and how this then impacts on people's health and well-being and the relationships and being in the world. Importantly, epigenetics, if we come back to that first picture from the Healing Foundation, if you improve environments, then you can improve people's health. And so that's part of the hope, is the idea that epigenetics has this, unlike genetics, which is much more hardwired and fixed, that you can actually change environments and change people's health. So you can see those resonances there. Another way of thinking about epigenetics is through ideas of intergenerational blood memory, and this is the beautiful work of Natalie Harkin, who is a Narungga woman and an activist poet from South Australia and an academic. And she says our bodies too in this work are archives where memories, stories, and lived experiences are stored, etched and anchored in our bloodlines deep. And we need to, as in a Western framing, we need to move outside of this idea of bodies, bloodlines, songlines, being just invoked in individual bodies. Again, thinking about relational ontologies, these archives, these blood memories radiate through different times and places and lands, through biological time, the violence of settler colonial histories, bodies within bodies, non-human entities and landscapes, molecular temporalities and cultural interpretations and embodied experiences of kinship and ancestors. So as much as epigenetics can provide a framework for understanding intergenerational trauma, it was also rejected by participants in our study. And I just want to briefly note three of these refusals. And the first one is an outright refusal of epigenetics, because it does carry that, a particular violent history of genetic experiments which were done on Indigenous peoples. So epigenetics was seen as useless knowledge. Useful for whom? What are the interventions? How does it address racism and other social determinants of health? So one Indigenous scientist said, well, that's great, but at the end of the day, really, how's that going to change the fact that we know that Indigenous kids, for example, need more love and attachment and a good diet? These epigenetics findings are going to show that we're just going to need the same interventions anyway. The second refusal was around the catch-all of trauma. And so this participant said, it's not called what it is. It's not called rape. It's not called colonisation. It's not called racism. So it's just called trauma. And so they're refusing to use epigenetics as a totalising frame, and instead focusing more on a strength-based approach, wanting to focus on Indigenous survival and flourishing. And the third point is around what Eve Tuck calls damage-centred research, this refusal to participate in deficit research, because there is the danger that if you say that my biology at a molecular level, at that such a reductionist narrow level is damaged, then what are you saying about me? You know, it's almost like the last sort of form of colonisation at that molecular level. And so epigenetic hype does take away from the actualities of what is happening, which is these structural racisms around poverty, disadvantage, lack of housing, and so forth. And I won't speak about it here, but we've also written about the ways, the biopolitics here, about the ways in which Indigenous women are increasingly blamed for poor diets. It's just that narrowing, that reductionist biopolitical debate. Thank you. And so if there is no attention to the malleability of epigenetics, and the science can be presented as very deterministic, there's always a risk that people will start to adopt eugenic approaches, and it will weaken social policy rather than strengthen it. And so we say proceed with caution. It does create hope. It moves beyond victim blaming to the continuing slow violence of settler colonialism. It does intersect with some Indigenous knowledges and worldviews. There is a potential of reversal, but it does locate trauma as originating in the bodies of Indigenous peoples as a kind of imperial debris, and this is a very dangerous territory to return to. It has the capacity to conceal forms of control through identification of Indigenous peoples as biologically damaged, thus furthering state and medical justification for yet more intervention in Indigenous lives. So thank you.
Thank you for that very interesting presentation. We are moving down to our second speaker. Let's see if I can get her Polish pronunciation. Małgorzata. Let me know if I did okay. Wosińska. We'll be speaking on the paper Building Emotional and Intellectual Resilience in the Polish Academic and Research Environment. She is a genocide anthropologist and psychotraumatologist, and senior lecturer at the Network on Humanitarian Action at the Faculty of Law and Administration at the University of Warsaw. She's also supervisor of the documentary research project Testimonies of War, dedicated to the experience of Ukrainian refugees. She works in critical Holocaust and genocide studies, museum studies, forensic studies, and has worked on projects around genocide survivors in Rwanda and commemorization of that. So why don't I just give the floor to you, Margot.
Hello. Thank you. So in this presentation, I would like to explore the impact that knowledge and practices rooted in psychotraumatology, like group supervision or concept of resilience. Even after yesterday, I know that probably my understanding of resilience is a little bit too shallow or too optimistic, but thank you very much. But still, I like the concept of resilience, especially in cultural studies framework. So I am interested how those practices could impact and maybe something change on humanities, on humanistic studies in Poland. Especially we see that it could change something in recent years. And even I'm going to speak about Polish academia, I'm thinking about other universities which are running in post-totalitarian countries. Because I'm going to speak about PTSD after post-totalitarian regimes and about the production of knowledge. And in the beginning, I wanted to show you some case studies, maybe from Rwanda, maybe from Holocaust, some testimony. But then I realized that I'm not going to hide behind the case studies, and I would like to find words, my own words about epistemic justice and epistemic injustice, about geographies of knowledge. So the place where I am coming from and how I am thinking about trauma and why. And that's why thank you so much, Australian and New Zealand team, because you also allowed us to understand your geographies of knowledge. I'm asking question, how do we study trauma at the university or coming from the university that it's itself burnt with the legacy of post-feudal, post-socialistic violence and remains in a state of dissociation? And there is a very particular political reason standing behind. It's only 1 hour flight from Warsaw, where I am working, to Denmark, to Copenhagen, but we are living on very different planets. Something like that, like cult mind, could be impossible in the Warsaw University, because what they are doing, they are completely separating medicine and objectivity and neutrality and history, humanistic science, and they are afraid that if we'll mix it, then historians, anthropologists will start to speak about their own trauma. So we prefer to keep it separate. And they don't want us to think critically, absolutely, in Poland. That's true, or at least it was like that by last 15 years. So a bit about my geographies of knowledge. I am a genocide anthropologist and psychotraumatologist, 3rd generation after the Second World War. I am a Polish Jew, a woman who, despite the political tension, especially last 15 years, especially for women, if you even think about abortion in Poland, you can go to jail, the same like our gynecologist. Remember, like 2 years ago when I was in Israel, I saw demonstration in Tel Aviv against changes in the court, and they had the banners, we are not like Warsaw, we don't want to be like Poland. So then I realized that it's really not good. Our reputation, radical reputation, is really not positive, like some of radical politicians would like to think. So I decided to stay in Poland anyhow. Poland is an amazing country, very interesting. Even though some historians are calling Poland bloodlands, like Timothy Snyder, or like fantastic Austrian writer and historian Marty Polak, he is calling Poland contaminated landscape. And it's true, because Poland is a one big mass grave. The trauma is embodied there, and when people from abroad coming to visit Poland, they are very often coming to visit Poland to visit Auschwitz. I live in Warsaw, in the district of Muranów, built on the ruins of the Jewish ghetto, in the heart of former Jewish ghetto. And I deal with traces of war trauma every day. And of course, I'm not the only one. But I'm also not the only one who have enough of fulfilling the idea of Polish Jewish martyrology. And this is 3rd generation. What we are doing as a 3rd generation. On the left side, you can see the place, one of the newest memorial on Holocaust, opened like 2 or 3 years ago. It was a place where the very important archive, Ringabu archive, was hidden. It was an archive written by historians and normal people living in ghetto in the moment of the war, not after the war. So it's not an interpretation of what was happening, but they were writing what's going on in the moment of war. So their language is a vernacular language. There is no word Holocaust there, because the word Holocaust was established after the Second World War. They're writing about what's going on very critically. They're writing about things like prostitution in ghetto. They're writing about violence in ghetto between Jewish people. Those kind of narration could never show up after the Second World War. And it was exactly hid here. And by coincidence, luckily, after the Second World War, when they were rebuilding the district they founded, it was hidden in the iron boxes and milk cans. And as you see, the 3rd generation decided that we don't want to create martyrological monuments anymore. We want something very light. We want to find a balance between the heavy memory and landscape, which is supposed to be green, and also on the side of life, a landscape which is inclusive. So you see there's only a glass box, very, very light, to keep this competition of memory on stable level, but also allow people to live there. By the way, my balcony is just here, so I was taking picture from the balcony, so I am very close to this museum, but it's not massive, it's not re-traumatizing, it's very light. And the same on the right, it's the fantastic art, contemporary art museum in Warsaw. They opened an exhibition of modernistic Ukrainian Maria Primachenko, painter, and she was, of course, involving folklore as an anti-war movement, and she was working till, even she was born in 1910, 1918, but she was working till late 90s. And she was using positive aspects, like aspect of beauty to confront it with difficult reality. And after after 2 years of constant flowing in pictures from war in Ukraine, people cannot stand it anymore. But when they opened that particular exhibition, it was a success. So we want to speak about trauma, but we don't want to stack in the darkness or victimhood position anymore. And just about Maria Primachenko, just if you will be interested, and a little bit about Ringabu Archive. This is exactly place where it was hidden. This is the moment when they found it in 1947, and the memorial was seen a moment ago. It was of course the same place. Okay. Wait. Okay. Okay. So. I will underline that once more time. It's important to note that Polish culture and society, especially older generations, still grapple with the phenomenon of post-traumatic dissociation, rooted in experience from the Second World War, the Holocaust, but also the communist violence, as well as the challenging period of political transformation. Emotions, autobiographical experiences, the vulnerability of research topics, and their influence on scholars were, until recently, considered shameful and unrecognized and unprofessional. The same applied to personal development needs, including psychotherapy on private level. University demanding a facade of neutrality and objectivity, while trauma has been a subject of study, it has rarely been acknowledged as a potential influencer on researchers themselves. What is a paradox, because we are living in Poland and we're supposed to be the best with working with trauma, but we are not. And yesterday, Andreas from Switzerland, he was mentioning survival messages. Those are survival messages we are receiving. The first generation telling us that we're supposed to be like soldiers and using our fight or flight mode to cope with the reality. And the second generation, when we are working with, also at the universities right now, they're a bit in a stage of depression. They are rather telling us, you never find the proper words because you are working with the darkness, no proper words. And they're working on affect. Unconscious affect constantly. That's why the Polish politics scene is so effective as well. And there's a third generation, and we're much more closer to activism, and we want to break the circle of trauma, and we, of course, want to decolonize ourselves from the martyrology and victimhood position. And just an example, when I was doing research years ago on Ponary, this is a place of mass killing close to Vilnius, Holocaust by bullets, and I was working on mass graves. I was 21, and my professor, my tutor, he was already 75, first generation, and he was absolutely astonished about this topic. I was conducting research how people were picking up from the mass grave mushrooms and blueberries, and how environmental aspects of mass graves were working with the local society. And he told me, this is perfect topic, do it, fantastic. No ethical questions, no questions about how even if it can influence on me. Next, I moved to Rwanda. I spent in Rwanda 7 years working on mass graves in Rwanda, and then I was working with human remains, bodies, and I asked him once, do you think that there is somebody at university I can talk about it? And say, absolutely not, you are prepared. You are prepared, you are from Poland, you are third generation after Holocaust. Everything is fine, go for it, this is a fantastic topic. So now we know that we have to find our boundaries. And this is also an example of the boundaries. This is my window from the Moranov, and I want to make it green. And we want to see the traumatic reality, talking now from psychotraumatological perspective, is not my reality. Even in embodied sense or geographical sense, is so close to me, but it's not me, it's not myself. And I wrote some text for Haus der Kultur den Welt about third generation, but the title is Everyone Can Be a Third Generation, Trauma as a Space of Choice. So I do strongly believe that somebody from second generation also could be emancipated from this traumatic situation, which works like a drug, of course. It works like a drug because thinking about trauma also brings us joy, brings us endorphins, adrenaline, cortisol. So we could be addicted to trauma. As a clinician, you know it very, very well. Okay. And it's changed a little bit when we face the crisis of war in Ukraine. And it was amazing how the crisis could help us, paradoxically, to face with something which was completely hidden. So I'm asking the question, is facing the crisis could bring you some positivity? So as you know, probably we had 1.5 million refugees in Poland, and we weren't prepared for that, absolutely. And then first generation using their fight or flight mode, and the second generation using their affect, and the third generation using their activism. We were working together when we were helping refugees. But then also it opened the black box of trauma, which was present geographically, but it was hidden inside ourselves. It was silence amongst our family. So people started thinking about the Second World War experience. They never talk about family with a family. So something which was a representation by 70, 80 years, neutral object, became something which was close to our body. And somehow it opened also our university. First time when we allow psychologists or psychotraumatologists to be present in humanistic department, history, etc., was when we have people from Ukraine working at the university in Poland, because what we can do, it was offering jobs, for instance, for people who had to emigrate. Or we had students from Ukraine, same like the group from Belgium yesterday were reporting about how they were supporting Ukraine. We were forced to do it, but because of it, we opened our own wounds, and it was good, because at least we can heal. So I'm thinking about the resilience and crisis as something which we can negotiate between two nations, two ethnic groups, and how we can learn from each other, even we are in the crisis situation. But also I think as a decolonization, as a process which do not touch only non-European countries. We have to decolonize ourselves from our victimhood position. So this is for me a task to do. And just I want to tell you that we are, as a group of third generation, quite active, tried to do something against the dissociation at the university, and being honest, hierarchy, patriarchal hierarchy, long before war in Ukraine, long before COVID. And this is one of the initiatives we created, a resilience academic team. And it happened only because one professor, Ewa Domańska, extraordinary professor, she decided to do something transdisciplinary, but without any financial support from institutions. So we were working almost like an underground, in secret. And we are working till now, but it was giving us and still giving us freedom. And it was 2020 we started to work, and in 2017 we decided to give a name, to at least do something official. Resilience Academic Team, acronym is RAT. RAT, know how to adapt. So we are trying to adapt. And the truth is that now we are after PhD, where I'm associate professor, somebody is working in Stanford. She allows us to think critically, and to this, we, thanks to her, we can travel, I can be here, but it happened out of the official institutions. And now I'm thinking about the research on trauma in Poland. We had fantastic researcher in Poland just after the Second World War. Fantastic psychiatrist. The idea of concentration lager syndrome was, of course, researched in Poland, in Jagiellonian University, close to Auschwitz. The idea of survivor's guilt was written also in Polish, but in Poland by Polish researchers, but or they emigrated because of the anti-Semitism in Poland after the Second World War, or they were working in silence, in secret, because there was such a fear after the Second World War of giving oral, verbal narration of anything, that till now every archives are hidden. Yes, 2 minutes, I am finishing. And just I want to tell you that there are two values which are keeping us together as a resilience academic team. And one value is academic kinship. I would like to bring the concept of academic kinship. And academic kinship is a situation, this is our group, by the way. Academic kinship is a matter of choice, is a relation not based on blood ties, but on intellectual and ethical bond, or self-auto-reflective, like in our case. And the second value is anticipatory thinking. So we're thinking about crises from with the positive attitude, I would say. Okay, and just to finish, if you would be interested about the project, where we met with Peter, a fantastic project, because we brought the supervision to the Warsaw University when we started this project, Testimonies of the War, and also we had to change completely the ethics and methodology of oral history. We were working a lot with oral history, but 70, 80 years ago, from the historical perspective, but it's very different when you're working with embodied experience. We have to think about a very different ethics, very different methodologies, so I strongly recommend you to check a project if you will be able to. Supervision was an amazing experience for me, but the funny thing, I was running the supervision, and I just want to quote Ania Wolegała. She was a chief of the project, and soon there will be a description of whole project article and communistic and post-communistic studies, so you can follow it. But what she quoted, the supervision replaced formalized ethical guidance, which our institution did not provide in our very challenging past. And story is that I am not mentioned officially in the project as a member of the team because the university was afraid that they realized that I am working as a psychotraumatologist, but in the same moment I am cultural anthropologist and working at the university. So we are looking constantly from the back door, yes, how to open the topic of emotions. I know that we have a long road to do it, but I still believe that it's also influenced how I am educating. And just the last word, this is my group from Humanitarian Action 2 weeks ago in Auschwitz. We're in Auschwitz, but as you see, they are smiling because a process of setting boundaries and recognizing boundaries is also to taking students to Oświęcim town, which is like 1 kilometer far away from Auschwitz, and they can feel themselves and they can feel the agency and subjectivity and not be traumatized only. So it's important, this balance is important. And one important aspect, they're coming mostly from Middle East. So I am running Holocaust studies for people who are coming from Jordan, from Lebanon, from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. And if you ask me, is it possible to do it today? I would ask you yes. But the boundaries and materiality has to be transformed not via nationality, ethnicity, politics, but through human being, well-being and resistance. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Our third speaker today is Celestin Mutuyimana. Yamana. Oh. I do want to emphasize, of course, the great international character of this panel and of the whole conference. We have speakers from Australia, Poland, and Rwanda. So, great job, organizers. He will be speaking on visual narratives, unveiling cultural scripts of trauma sequelae in Global South trauma victims. Celestin is a psychotherapist, researcher, filmmaker, trainer, mentor, and project manager from Rwanda, and is currently postdoc fellow and psychotherapist in Zurich at the Collegium Helveticum. He works with trauma-related disorders, intergenerational trauma, and identifying protective factors against post-traumatic transferences. With that, Celestin.
Thank you. I was talking about cultural scripts of trauma in Global South and in Africa in general. But it's a concept which have been described maybe by my supervisor, Andreas Maker, and David, who was talking about cultural script of trauma. It's actually the trauma-related symptoms, post-traumatic and cultural-related symptoms, which are not highlighted in manual, standard manual of diagnostics. This is what is called cultural script of trauma, and we look how they are also interlinked and how they are connected with cultural beliefs and values. We are looking why are we interested in this project of cultural script of trauma, because we think not only the symptoms which are known in standard categorizations, but there are other specific cultural-based symptoms which are not yet discovered. And this is what this project is. The first, as a filmmaker, I use three ways of reporting the research. One is qualitative, and the first papers of qualitative studies have been published in Element of Cultural Scripts of Trauma in East Africa and in Switzerland, but also I use quantitative study, which is ongoing. Here we will see some cut of video which shows why, and the film is called Hear My Voice, where trauma survivors and spiritual healers and psychotherapists in Africa and in global south in general will talk about the symptoms and how the culture influences the symptoms. I don't know if I will have time, but I will try to skip when I will start to feel a pressure of time. So I start with the motivations which pushed us to start this project, because as clinicians we'll see people with different symptoms, but then we are somehow confused. I can play, but I don't know if it will be played, because this is a video. Okay, is it going now? Okay. Maybe it's there is a lot of light. Okay, good. There should be sound. Yeah, there is sound. There is no sound? Yeah, there is sound. I know. I'm sorry, because if there is no sound, then it will not be. I would prefer to say rather than to watch things. This is very much unfortunate. So maybe you can read. Good. I go to the next. As a filmmaker, then film means emotions. If there is no emotions, it's almost yeah, but it's something. So why do people in our community in Africa may have different symptoms? Because of different reasons. One reason is their specific traumatic exposure. It's corrective, it's man-made, it's horrific, and the symptoms of one person is shared. It's not really individual symptoms, it's community symptoms. And for example, in our community in Rwanda, perpetrators, they still live together with the survivors. So it's those kind of symptoms, they should not be like the symptoms of isolated case. So here, I will skip again, but here the trauma survivors are now talking about the different symptoms. You can read again. I'm sorry, because I'm not hearing. This is the traumatic experience. I skip it. So those who live in country, they still have a lot of traumatic experiences. But also those who leave their country and they live in refugees, they also have similar experiences. They experience sexual abuse, human trafficking, imprisonment. Here there is a video which shows the therapist in Europe which received those patients with so unfamiliar symptoms. But then it's very hard to listen it. So this kind of symptoms, this kind of traumatic exposure with correctivistic communities, it's possible, of course, that they exhibited the symptoms highlighted in DSM, but they also exhibited the symptoms, unfamiliar symptoms. This is what we call it. And this is cultural script of trauma. And those symptoms need also to be recognized and be treated. Here they were also another video. It's about, let's try to see if you can lead also on historical trauma. Let's read subtitles, but for example, here, no subtitles. Yeah, it's better if we hear. Sorry? It would be good if we will be able to hear.
So, but he has to remove it from the screen in order to put it back in a different way. That's why it won't be on screen for now.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm just warning you.
Okay, good. Sorry. Yes, she gave me a very brave advice that I can make my comments. I can even finish my all comments, and then you will watch the movie. This is very nice. So I will say, in general, I was on the side that those people they experience more, they exhibit more other specific symptoms, and those symptoms are not only at an individual level, but also they are at a community level. For example, a high level of mistrust, which was also spoken in Australia, or body-related symptoms where people have a headache, stomachache, or a lot of menstruations, and those symptoms they are not anywhere. And we have also symptoms, family-related symptoms, where people think they take a bad decision of not a bad decision, but they say, I will not get married, or others say, I will need to have a lot of children despite the means they have. So, and all those symptoms are connected to cultural values. One of the cultural values or belief is to hold the sadness. For example, in my culture, it's very sign of strongness that you are a good person, strong person, if you don't share your sufferings. And to share your sufferings is a symptoms of weakness. So, and another thing is community reputations. I am a leader. I am now a postdoc, a doctor, and I should not show what I am suffering from. I should really try to hide because of my community reputation, which is something very much important. And also there is other values because now intergenerational trauma, and then children does not have any role in the community because they have to follow the guidance of their parents. So cultural values. And another thing, even in Ukraine and in Afghanistan, because we made also study in Afghanistan, Christianity, where some churches, they said, if you have problem, please go and pray God, everything will disappear. Then this is also something bad to trauma victims. Now I will say like conclusions that we need 4 things to identify all those cultural specific symptoms and to know what can we do by developing cultural sensitive psychotherapies, because then we know the problems. We have also to develop the answer to those problems. And then after developing those solutions, I call it homegrown solutions, because we should not continue only. I really respect those techniques which have been invented. I am not recalling they are invented and they are not cultural, they are Eurocentric. To me, it's not correct. They are cultural sensitive in Europe. Then we need all those cultural sensitive in other communities. And we can borrow from those which have been developed, but also adapted to current symptoms. The other thing is to institutionalize those techniques. I may say, currently in our universities, clinics, we still use and study only CBTs, psychoanalysis, which is good, but also they are not responding the entire problems that we have. We need also to develop community-based interventions, because we should not welcome one client where there is a mass trauma. A collective trauma cannot be healed by individual way of treatment. We should develop a community-based interventions, and we can also include psychotherapists, but also pupil community facilitators. That means the way of the development of intervention does not only include the intervention that will be tailored or provided by psychotherapists, but also other people who might help, and then we heal our community in mass. This is maybe what I can say. If the voice will come, this is good. If it does not come, then we will finish. Yes, they're trying to see, and the video, I was saying the movie will be soon published, but it is still in draft in the editing. This is why I was, I need when you find some mistake, I know here there are a lot of filmmakers. When you find some mistakes, then tolerate it, please. It's still under progress. But I believe, I can tell you that even the published one will have mistakes. Don't worry. That it will not be perfect. But then from that mistakes, we will make another one good. So I was... It's not clear. So I thank you very much for listening to me and to be the last author of of the talks that happen here, and I am happy and look forward for the discussions.
No sound.
Amahoro, ubumwe, kwizerana no kubaha indangagaciro z'umuco nibyo biranga sosiyete yunze ubumwe kandi itekanye. Ariko iyi mibereho myiza ihinduka mu gihe gito, yaba abantu bahuye n'ubugome ndengakamere nka jenoside. Uku niko byagenze no mu gihe cya jenoside yakorewe abatutsi mu Rwanda mu 1994. Intimba iterwa no kwibuka ubuhemu bagiriwe, guhorana amakenga no kutizera babahemukiye, kwiyumva nk'abatagifite agaciro, kwiyumva nk'abadafite imbaraga zo guhangana n'ibibazo, kubabazwa n'ibikorwa byiza bagiraga mu muco wabo bitakiriho, ibyiyumvo ko ibibazo byose bahura nabyo bikomoka kuri jenoside. Ibi byose bikomeza kuba umuzi w'ibindi bibazo byo mu mutwe abarokotse jenoside bahura nabyo. None twakora iki? Hope it's coming.
naciye mu bintu bikomeye narigungaga sinari nseka njyewe imyaka y'ubuzima bwanjye imyinshi nayimaze naseka, abantu bari bazi ko ntajya nishima, narigungaga. Ikindi kimenyetso nagiraga gikomeye, ntabwo njyewe najyaga nizera, nta muntu nizera, uretse ko n'icyo kimenyetso n'ubu ntigifite.
numva n'ubu ngubu nifitiye igisubizo ntabisubiza cyo kumva ntari abana ntaragezaho, kumva narigeze kumva ubuhamya ngeze aho mfata umuntu wari uri imbere ndamuniga, nabashaga no kuba nafata amabuye nkagenda nyajyanye mu ijipo nkagenda nkavuga nti ndari gukubita mu mutwe cyangwa se ndari muri make.
Nanjye rero wari ku ruhande rwakoze jenoside, kuba nanjye ndamwikinga cyangwa nkumva sinshaka kubona nawe, ubwo nawe nk'umuntu w'umunyarwanda muzima afite uko wambona wakubona ko mfite igihunga, afite ubwoba.
Hari igihe nanjye twagiye kwibuka tuza kureba filime, byarangiye mbona nirutse nagiye mu muriro ahantu bari bacanye, nashidutse ndi kwa muganga nshya ntazi uko byagenze. Ikindi nagiraga, nagiye mu kiliziya bavuze ngo duhane amahoro ya Kristu, ngiye kuramutsa umuntu mbona n'uwo nzi, naramunize, narwaniye mu kiliziya jyewe. Jyewe narwaye umutwe cyane, ndwara umutwe hahandi narwaye no guhuma, kuko narwaye umutwe wa mwene hano inyuma. Nkumva kubaho kwanjye ngomba guceceka nkaheza aha, singira umuntu mbwira ibyanjye, singira umuntu nganira, kandi buri muntu wese. Ubundi ikindi cyamumerekeje cyane nasaruyemo muri ibyo byose ni igifu. Igifu kikandya ku buryo buri cyumweru nahoraga ndi kwa muganga.
Mu ishuri ubundi nahoraga ndwara, rwose nifuzaga kwicarana n'umuntu w'umwana wakorewe jenoside. Sinajyaga numva nifuza nuko umuntu nakumva avuga ngo afite se, ngo afite ba nyirarume, afite ba nyirasenge, nkumva simbishaka mu mutima wanjye.
Ibimenyetso bikomeye umuntu yari afite harimo nko kuba yumva adashobora kuryama ngo asinzire. Nta muntu wangiriraga neza ngo numve ko ariyo, kuko numvaga ineza itakibaho.
Сердце, конечно, разбитое, но мне кажется, солнце, но черного цвета. На то время я боли не ощущала никакой. У меня дрожали руки от каждого звука, даже если чашку поставишь на стол, мне начинало так телепать.
Или сон, нарушение сна?
Не спала я вообще, нет.
I would just cry, lock myself up in my room. I ended up just growing withdrawing. I would say I was a very angry child, but I rarely did show it because I'd learned to conceal my emotions. Because every time I tried to show emotions, my mom would be like, usimfanyie hivyo, ni babako, he's your dad, don't do that to him. But then when I'm alone, it would just hit me and I'd be I'd cry a lot. And I was so angry to a point sometimes when I'm alone, I'll just throw something, break something, just to feel I've let it out. For the interactions, I did find it hard to I hated. And also making friends was hard for me because I felt I couldn't trust anyone.
Avoiding people. I do withdraw. For me, if I sense sort of a change from you and you are close, I withdraw completely. Number two, it's to talk about my issues. It's to ask for help. It's so hard for me to ask for help because I'm used to fending for myself, doing things alone. I used to have headaches, stomach aches, a lot of anxieties, so my dignity was neglected because I never had someone
started 10 minutes late. I assume we have another 10 minutes towards the discussion time, so we'll finish up at 25 after. That means we have 20 minutes for discussion. We've come through very difficult themes. As I talked about, it's quite an international panel researchers speaking about violence, colonial violence, genocide, and yet there are several themes that go across their talks. The issue of the transgenerational, how people are impacted and lived by trauma in each new generation, the move away from an individualized approach to trauma. I think this is so important, with a focus on the bodily as opposed to inner psychic life, and to focus on cultural expressions of trauma as opposed to the universality, which may be Western cultural expression. And the question also about how we can respond, protest, alleviate, heal, anger, justice, or protective borders. So a wide range of issues, and we open the floor to discussion.
I have a question to Małgosia. As a fellow Pole from Warsaw, in my case, also with some Jewish ancestry, what you presented feels very close to home, almost too close. I know you're also a traumatologist, so I would be curious to know a little more, how does this intergenerational trauma, these different layers of trauma, play out in people's bodies, like in your practice as a traumatologist and a researcher? An additional question, if there's time, you talked a little bit about politics and politicians and how trauma sort of plays out in this theater of Polish politics. I would be curious to hear a little bit more about this.
About their symptoms? About politics?
I mean, like, how do you identify this trauma sort of echoing in Polish political life?
Very briefly, I will tell, and the closest example is my family. Sorry to bring my family, but it will be very easy for me to describe. So the first generation, when I am, my grandma, she's a survivor, still alive. When she is a public witness, so she is attending often to some official situations. When I'm going with her, after 5 hours, I don't have energy. After 12 hours, she is okay. She is waking up 5 a.m., doing her program. She is 87, 88. She has such a strong, I would say, fight or flight response mode, adrenaline, cortisol, endorphin. Very often this first generation, talking about the body, they are tight, full of energy, which is coming from natural opioids. And you don't see the flexibility in the body. The body is closed. There's a vitality, but I wouldn't say it's a positive vitality. It's a different kind of vitality, determination maybe. Second generation, when I'm looking, for instance, at my mother, it's when we are talking about this anxiety and a bit more into the depression situation, opposite to these first responders and fight or flight mood. The second generation has symptoms very often, many symptoms. Problems with eating and problem with psychosomatic problems and headaches and migraines and all this stuff which are connected with that I don't feel well physically and mentally. So it's a kind of, it's about dissociation. But dissociation in which you are completely disintegrated and your body is also disintegrated. And then the third generation, we want to feel our body beyond trauma. So we want to feel what is coming from us and what is inherited and what is coming from triggers from outside. We want to recognize the pain is not a fear. For my mother, for the second generation, pain means fear. We are trying to feel our body as it is, reality as it is. When it's painful, it's painful. When it's not painful, it's not painful. But then you can negotiate your body. And this is a beautiful story then. Started. And talking about politics, we can talk about hours, but just one example. After Smolensk catastrophe in Smolensk, you know that our government, had this terrible accident in 2010. Our country was literally run by people who were completely traumatized. And there were no emotions, and there were psychopathic almost behaviors. You cannot even recognize the emotions in the face of politicians by years. It was very dangerous. So the problem with politicians is that there is a violence and also this radicalization of government. For me, it's unfortunately, talking about Israel, post-traumatic reaction to okay, some difficult situation in the past. So you can see it physically in television, how they are using their voice in radio, but also you can see it very clearly what kind of this political decision they are making.
Małgorzata, I was interested in just trying to understand a bit more, but I think in a way your previous answers maybe illustrated this about how you begin on that process of decolonizing the self from this victimhood, but perhaps you've answered it.
Both horizontally, as a person who cannot think critically because of the government, and also amongst the family, in which you don't want to be a slave of the emotions which you are inherited. So in this thing, I'm thinking about decolonization, and on the global level, it's about getting out from the victimhood position, and it's not only about my nation, it's also about Hungarians, Romanians, and many other post-totalitarian regimes. We don't want to think about ourselves. We want to feel brave, be brave, and, you know, have the courage to be present and to feel not to be, not to wait for being punished, not to be polite so much, not to feel that, yeah, I am coming from the shtetl, I don't know how to behave. It's a cultural code to be ashamed. So decolonization means also not to feel so much ashamed, also via on body level.
Question here. Excuse me, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This has been a very powerful and interesting panel altogether, so thank you to all of you. I wanted to ask a question to Megan about it's a cultural genocide, if I can use that term, you know, for that stolen generation. And your map was interesting. I can see that First Nation culture is diverse and complicated. And I'm just wondering, and you might not be able to answer this question, you know, how much, you know, that generation that was taken away from their culture, their cultural norms, their stories, their histories, you know, how much of an impact that's had on Australia in terms of the eradication of those, you know, kind of First Nation cultures. So thinking of genocide, cultural genocide in that way. Does that make sense? Yeah.
It does make sense. I'm going to defer to my colleagues in the room. I can really only speak as a non-Indigenous person about what we did in our project, but stolen generations as a particular significant event came up in our study about epigenetics in terms of historical trauma and ongoing trauma consistently, but people also said that this is just one event, and they consistently pointed to things like everyday racism, which is equally as powerful. But when you talk about Australia, you know, I need to ask, you know, which Australia are you talking about? So there has been an erasure of particular historical events in the settler colonial nation, and this is why the scholarship, the literature around the massacres, for example, has come to the fore, because it's really there's been people have tried to hide it. Governments have tried to hide it. In Australia, white Australia likes to think of itself as an egalitarian, you know, fair go, we're not a racist country, and it's just clearly not the case. It is a racist country. Genocide has occurred, but I will defer to my colleagues who perhaps would like to speak to that question.
Oh, no. Because Ray could have answered this question. Yes, okay, thank you. So to answer your question around the impact of colonisation is impacted on communities differently. If you look at the way settlers settled in Australia, there are mainly to the coastlines. Doesn't mean that the people in the central desert hadn't impacted, but culture still exists. And so one thing that we know, and the one thing that I was trying to instill across in my talk on the first day, was that regardless of that, you cannot break connection to country. Like, I use the example of my children are born on the West Coast. They have the Aboriginality through me. Their mother is English, third generation English person in Australia. When they never have grown up on my country, but when I take them to their to my country, I can literally see the country reach out and grab them in their. So when they come onto country, any anxiety they have, it melts. They get excited as they're coming into country. So this is something that's inherently built into our DNA. So I think I had a picture of a gentleman sitting with a red T-shirt on one of the things, and it was something that myself and Charlie was a production where it was Elder Noel, Dr. Noel Nennup talking about fire, telling stories about fire, Noel story about fire. But one of the most beautiful stories he told was this of the story of connection to country from a cellular level. When we practice corroborees and dance in space, in time and space, on the same place throughout thousands of years, our skin cells come off us and go into the land. And so when we talk about our relationship of this, the country is our land, that's what we do. So regardless of what happened in colonisation, that connection to country still exists. In my language is the Burigaba nation, their language, there's only one word left. But there's still lots of cultural ways of being and doing and knowing that still exists. So it's something that we continue to continue to revive, and it's something that's really important for us as Aboriginal people. You know, someone talked about cultural modesty. Aboriginal people will be culturally immodest because in our own country it's denied, right? It's denied our history, it's denied our culture. We will absolutely continue to talk about it because it's a really important, and it's exactly what you're talking about today. You know, it's really, the story of Australia is not 233 years old, it's 60,000 years old. And so any story of any country has both the bad parts and disruptions in it, and whilst we need to acknowledge where those disruptions are and learn from them, we also should celebrate the parts that the strengths that make us strong. So I think it's sort of permeates through all the three of the things. That's what I got from you, from what you were talking about, is that, you know, culture is really important. Trauma is is part of the story, but it's not the whole story that exists. Hopefully that answers the question.
And now I'm going to ask a question. My ears really perked up, Megan, when you used relational ontology to talk about indigenous worldviews. I come as a feminist philosopher. This has been an important contribution from feminist philosophy as well. And when I hear the discussions here, the importance of the cultural community approaches, the generational approaches, it seems just obvious. So for you, I'm curious for the panel, if you could each speak to, in your experience, how far is this kind of relational, reactive, intergenerational approach? How much is it being accepted in the field that you work with, and what kinds of resistance do you meet against it?
As an anthropologist, it's very key to my discipline, and I could quite easily have talked about Karen Barad, for example, and space-time matterings, but it's not what our participants talked about. I could theorise that, but then I think I would be doing a disservice by using an American feminist philosopher. I would much rather use indigenous philosophies and philosophers and theorists, so hence someone like Natalie Harkin, to speak to the work that we're doing with our advisory committee. But relatedness, relationships are absolutely key to what our Indigenous participants and our non-Indigenous participants who are working, so Indigenous non-Indigenous epigeneticists working in labs, working with Indigenous people, talked about relationships and relatedness. They talked about different ways of being in the world, and they were the things that they wanted to foreground in the science that they were doing. And so it wasn't a binary. They were actually working with these different ontologies in these institutions, in these labs, but with very different combined ontologies, but recognising the differences and the similarities.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. when I'm thinking about my own heritage, Jewish heritage or Poland, of course, I think that I can use these stories because there are some kind, like Miranda Fricker, fighting for epistemic justice or being against epistemic injustice, which is also like post-feministic. And of course, I can use it, and of course, I'm using it as a third generation and on the active side and a woman from the gender perspective. But then when I went to Rwanda, and I was so curious, talking about now psychotraumatology, because now I was talking about cultural anthropologist, but as a psychotraumatologist, and I went to Rwanda, and I was so interested in local ways how they are dealing with trauma. I realized that it's so difficult for me to get out from European cliché, even post-feministic, even post-anthropocentric, but still rooted in the Western concepts. It was so difficult for me, and in the end of the day, I realized that I cannot get out. And even so, I am going into this very contemporary direction, but still I know that I am rooted in this messianistic Judeo-Christian Freud, whatever. And, and I think it's also fair to admit it, you know. That's why we have you. And I was so interested in the idea of Guhahamuka and, you know, the concept of trauma in Kinyarwanda. But of course, I am thinking through this. Even I am feministic, etc. So I mean, this is inner discussion with myself, constant. Yes.
Yeah, to me, I think it's another way around because we have no enough scientific research that shows what is here and what is missing. I will say we are starting to develop it. We don't have enough tools, enough or not even. So we know the intergenerational trauma is there, but we don't know how to deal with the first, the second. Now we have the second generation. So it's all put together in the same umbrella called they have been traumatized. So I think it is something we need to, this is why we need to know what is the problem, what is the solutions, and how can we provide the solution, but also to different individuals with considering age, I mean generation, considering generations, but also considering the level of traumatic exposure, because people also were not traumatized as the same.
Okay, thank you. I think with that, we've used our time, so please join me in thanking our panel.